You have stepped into Reader's Labyrinth. And here is your host, Frank Schumpert.
Hey there, if you're watching this on YouTube, please give it a like and hit that subscribe button. It helps me reach a wider audience. Thanks for stopping by. Hello, I am Frank Schumpert, the creator and host of Reader's Labyrinth. Before we begin today's Thoughts from the Labyrinth segment, I would like to offer a very quick disclaimer, and I'm hoping to kind of head off at the pass any kind of misunderstandings or miscommunications between myself, my listeners, and my viewers. Before I get into that, if you are watching this on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button and like button. And if you are listening to this on Apple Podcast, hit pause, scroll on down, and please consider leaving me a 5-star review. If you are listening to this on Spotify, I would invite you to hit pause, head on up, give me a 5-star review, as well as hit the follow button on there. Whenever you do this, this helps me with engagement and it helps me with reach. And it's also a very easy and free way that you can encourage me to keep on going with this little project. So with that out of the way, I'm going to get on with today's out of the way disclaimer before I jump into the Thoughts from the Labyrinth segment. Today's topic is going to be on the writings and thoughts of the man and author Robert Greene. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right now in my little disclaimer. That's going to happen in the main show, but I want to offer for my viewers and listeners to keep in mind that I have nothing personal against Robert Greene. I want to make that very clear. I have purchased 3 of his books since the time I was in my 20s. I have read them, and I've tried to put certain practices of those books into my everyday life. So this is more of a segment about my experiences with that and my overall thoughts about his work. Second of all, I get a lot of emails. I'm going to say, and by a lot, I mean, this is a lot for me, maybe 2 or 3 a week with listeners and viewers who are asking my opinions on various books and authors, whether or not they should buy the book, whether or not I've heard of this author. And it seems like there's been an uptick in interest in Robert Greene recently. And so I've tried to answer these emails as best I can whenever Robert Greene will come up. I've tried giving them a detailed explanation for what I like about Robert Greene, what I don't like. But at the end of these emails, I just find myself recommending other self-help books. I find myself recommending other sources that could really help these folks who are looking for some guidance. And so I've kind of solidified my stance, not so much against Robert Greene and his books, but if you were to come up to me and ask me, hey, Frank, would you recommend any of the books of guests I've had on the podcast? The answer is an unequivocal yes. Now, when it comes to Robert Greene, I mean, he's never been on here. He's never going to be on here, most likely. I mean, I'm a small fry in his world, but I can't recommend his book 100%. I would have to ask clarifying questions of the person I am speaking with. If you are someone who's looking for direction in your life, then no, I do not recommend Robert Greene. If you are someone who is unsure of your future, you want a roadmap on how to succeed, the answer is no, I do not recommend Robert Greene. If you are someone with a passing interest in history, and you're not really a stickler for source material, you're just looking to be entertained, then yes, I would recommend Robert Greene. If you are somebody who just wants to familiarize yourself with a good marketing campaign, B, what a terrific book design cover really looks like, and 3, you just want to read the words of a very compelling author, although it is loaded down with rhetoric and anecdotal stories, then yes, I would recommend Robert Greene. So most of the books on here is a strict yes or no. Some of the emails I've gotten, would they recommend author A? And I would say no because of XYZ, or I would say yes because of ABC. With Robert Greene, it's a little bit of both. So what you are going to get in this Thoughts from the Labyrinth segment is simply that, my thoughts on Robert Greene. And ultimately, do I recommend him? I don't recommend him for everybody. I think if you implement his strategies, his rules, you're going to find yourself in a whole world of trouble. But more of that whenever the podcast or the YouTube channel, whichever one you're watching, whenever that actually starts, I'm going to get into it. So I just want to put that out there up front. I have nothing against Robert Greene personally. Like I said, I purchased 3 of his books in the past, so I've done my part as far as supporting him as an author. But here are my thoughts on this, and I hope this doesn't disturb anybody too much or upset anybody. And I also hope that this will provide some guidance if you are thinking about purchasing any of his works. Thank you, and let's get on with it. Hello, thanks for stopping by Reader's Labyrinth. In this segment of Thoughts from the Labyrinth, today I will be covering Robert Greene. He is the author of The 48 Laws of Power, The Art of Seduction, The 33 Strategies of War, The 50th Law, of which he co-authored with hip-hop artist 50 Cent, Mastery and the Laws of Human Nature. You can find Greene in the self-help section of your local Barnes & Noble or Books A Million. All his stuff is bestsellers from your usual suspects in the New York prison of legacy publishers. His target audience seems to be predominantly white, middle-class males, and if I had to guess, men in their 20s or guys who are trying their hand at a business venture, and also guys who are employed in highly competitive fields. And here I'm thinking sales, higher level governmental stuff, and even Hollywood. Although, with everything I just said, I stand to be corrected. I'm sure if you go on social media, you're going to find people who break the mold of a typical Robert Greene fan. So, book reviewers take great pleasure in painting Greene as a kind of modern day equivalent of Machiavelli, or even some have compared him to Sun Tzu. His books contain, quote, rules for life, living, war, art, business, and sex that he supposedly culled from primary research, I guess, derived from various fields in the humanities. Hence the numbers in his titles like 33 Strategies, and so on and so forth. He provides his readers with quasi-real, and I'll expand on my qualifier, historical personalities in military, political, and economic situations, in which the underdog outfoxes his opponents against overwhelming odds, snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. Now, how would that not make a cool story? And by the way, good luck finding anything in print that's critical of Robert Greene in a deep and meaningful manner. In fact, I wasn't surprised at all to learn that his books are quietly passed around the music, entertainment, government, political, and corporate worlds as a kind of street-smart guide or sneaky way of getting ahead, one in which might not be 100% ethical. But then again, that's kind of the marketing and selling point of his stuff. It kind of has a dark tinge to it, a mystique even. On that last point about finding sources critical of Greene, something I found out since doing Reader's Labyrinth is that it seems like a protective bubble settles around authors once they've established themselves in the New York Fortress of Solitude. You'll be hard-pressed to read anything critical about their work, not only including Greene, but for an example, just type in any of the big-name bestsellers out there, and I'm not going to name names on this, oh no. You might find a blog or video, kind of like what I'm doing, but no one really pays attention to us. But what you're not going to see is anything critical in something like the New York Times or Atlantic, unless, of course, the author's personal or political life and views somehow are cast out into the open. And we could spend an entire video, in fact, I'm putting one together right now, discussing the crossover and overt quid pro quo that's going on between the legacy publishers and these review places. But suffice it to say that most of the book reviewers out there, they're nursing literary ambitions of their own. And I've seen this especially not only in the trad publishing world, but in the indie publishing world as well. And there's nothing in and of itself evil or bad about that. It's just that most are hoping for a leg up over the competition by what I describe as nut hugging the big name authors and giving them stellar reviews when they probably don't really deserve it. So yeah, anyway, back to Robert Greene. First, we have to get this out of the way. I'm going to tell you up front, as in the disclaimer from earlier, that I'm kind of divided on recommending his books. And I think it's important that I state my biases clearly and in the open because A, if you are a hardcore Robert Greene fan, I want to give you a chance to bang out right now and go ahead and dislike this video. B, I hate it when a reviewer intentionally hides their biases against a book or subject, while the whole time pretending to be impartial. And not me, friends. What do I think about his books? Well, I kind of lean toward the camp of not really liking them, although there are some circumstances, if you want to be entertained, I would. Second, I'd like to say that after doing research for this video, I am 100% convinced, and I said this before, that Robert Greene himself is not a bad person at all. He seems like a really, really cool dude, an ethical man, and a man who is following his curiosity and a passion, and it has led him into authorship of a book that has touched many lives. And at the end of the day, he's just like one of us. He's trying to make it in this crazy roller coaster that we call life. And he hit on a very, and I do mean very successful book idea, which has enabled him to enrich himself. And for that, I don't fault you. I do not fault you, Robert Greene. If by the off chance, the 0.001% chance you ever come across this. So this isn't hate. To give you a little bit of background on Robert Greene, the story goes that Greene attended the University of California, Berkeley, and ended up getting a BA in classical studies from the University of Wisconsin. Then, with his mostly useless degree, and I will say this as someone who double majored in history and philosophy, so I say that with some irony and humor in that. I can say that because I majored in a useless degree as well. I feel his pain. He worked a lot of odd jobs, but he eventually ended up in Italy where he met a book packager whom he pitched his idea of a book based on history and philosophy that would become the 48 Laws of Power. In regards to Greene's strategies and rules, he's on the record as saying in an article by Telegraph on October 29, 2022, and the title of that article is Why Robert Greene Isn't Who You Think, which you will also find a link in the show notes. Quote, anybody who did would be a horrible, ugly person to be around. These are the words out of Robert Greene's own mouth in reference to a question about someone actually following any of the rules in his book. And this article, of which again you'll find a link in the show notes, only serves to support my idea that Greene doesn't believe his own bullshit. Because at the end of the day, Robert Greene's books is just mental porn for young men. And this is the heart of my thesis. So what I'm going to do is I will be getting into the why of my thesis a little further as we go along. Now, with everything I've said out of the way, if at the end of this video you do decide to full steam ahead and damn the torpedoes and get yourself some Greene, I mean, by all means, be my guest. Just keep in mind that Greene's books, and this is really at the heart of things, do not map onto reality. And if you are a seriously seeking individual, you're looking for guidance, you don't know where you're going, you're trying to figure out how the world works, his books can be downright terrible. And I'd even say fanciful guide to what human nature is, the workplace, and just these generally awful so-called rules for getting ahead in life. Worser still, in my opinion, is the fact that his stuff seems to be marketed towards, as I've said multiple times at this point, men in their early 20s. I can remember back then, you're facing a transition of sorts, a weird twisting of your inner world into facing the cold, hard winds of the real world. Thus, if you are contemplating buying this book for a friend or loved one, I'd advise extreme caution if they are in this age range. And if you check the show notes, I will be providing a list of books I recommend that will actually help your friend or loved one get ahead in life and find something in themselves to be proud of. And it kind of depends. I may just let you know here on the show, just kind of depends on how long this runs. So let me tell you how I got sucked into Greene's books. I'm trying to recall when I was in my 20s, okay? And it was a very vulnerable time. I didn't know what I'd be doing right out of college. Like I said, I had double majored in history and philosophy. I had no real plan, and although I'd worked jobs like serving tables and late night shifts at a gas station, the idea of cutting the college, that umbilical cord with a bachelor's degree was a terrifying prospect. I'd be officially an adult, and like most millennials entering the workforce between 2007 and 2011, the job market was pretty lousy. Even jobs normally in high demand, like in the IT, legal, health, and business world, I'm here to tell you, it seemed like nobody, and I mean nobody, was hiring. Lots of folk ended up moving back in with the parents. And if Pierre Zion is to be believed, it set the millennial cohorts back by about 6 years. We are 6 years late in starting everything. It was a really crappy time, to be honest. And during this time, I found myself sinking into a kind of depression. Thus it was in the rotten state of affairs that I wandered into the self-help section of my local Barnes & Noble. It was there that the slick book cover design of Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War contrasted against the bland and boring books settled next to this would-be modern Machiavelli. And this is something I would like to pause on and mention just for a moment. And this is a compliment, the superb book cover design of Greene's work. Really, they're eye-catching and kind of lend a weird feeling when you look at it. It's hard to describe. It's a triangle symbol set against a backdrop, but it has almost erotic undertones and phallic imagery to it. Something that you'll see in the video, but really, you'll just have to hold a hard copy. And boy, there's the phallic again. In your hands, you'll get a truer sense of what I mean. But as someone who's very unsure of himself in the 20s, it felt like I was kind of grasping a talisman of masculinity itself. And I can't imagine this wasn't a major contributor to Greene's work becoming a bestseller. So I would like to offer a kudos to whomever designed the book cover. Good job, no, great job on that front. Anyway, I ended up with 33 strategies and taking it home. And this book would remain a constant companion for me, contrasted against my growing philosophical worldview and growing tension as my experiences with the real world, sorry about that, I can't talk today, grew after I finally landed my first, quote, big boy job. Another book, this one was actually given to me, called The Art of Seduction years later. But in my opinion, The Art of Seduction, it seems to be one of Greene's overall weaker literary works, and it seemed to lack the passion and faux insight his other works elicited. And so my opinion of The Art of Seduction is that it mainly just had a bunch of filler content. I mean, I don't know. That's just my opinion on that work. I know that there's entire threads out there and they absolutely love it, so good for them. But for me, there wasn't anything in there that I could really use. I was really, kind of taken by. But my attention always would go back to the 33 Strategies of War, and I believe that this kind of sums up Greene's corpus the best. And another, before we kind of really dig in, work worth mentioning is going to be the book he co-authored with the rapper 50 Cent, The 50th Law. So this was published back in 2009. Now, I was late to the Greene game. After all, I bought 33 Strategies. This would have been in 2010. But I ended up buying the book he created with 50 Cent as well. And I would have purchased this book about 6 months later. To sum up the book, it mixes Greene's musing of strategy along with stories of 50 Cent's street exploits as he rose in the hip hop world. Now, I'm just going to say that I think 50 Cent is full of absolute shit, as his recent lawsuits and bankruptcy trials have shown. These anecdotal stories harkening back to his hustler days are just completely unsubstantiated. Now, although I was at one time buying into the false worldview of Greene and 33 Strategies of War, I actually kind of pride myself for not falling 100% for the turgid ramblings of 50 Cent's corner hustling recalls. And for this, I actually have to credit my useless degree, my background in philosophy and logic, as well as history. Nevertheless, my education and worldly experience couldn't inoculate me completely against a wily author hitting all the right spots. I ended up, as I said earlier, completely buying into 33 strategies, and I began to attempt to work Greene's rules into my life. I'm one of the lucky ones. By the time I grew and matured by facing challenges and overcoming anxieties, both professionally and personally, I was able to kind of come to a plane and see that Greene didn't possess any esoteric secret nature of human reality. That his historical examples used in 33 strategies, well, they're mostly fanciful interpretation of events in history, not grounded in any real academic primary research. In other words, his stuff is entertainment for the history and philosophy buff, and that is a stretch, but nothing more. However, there are others not so fortunate. I was once part of a Facebook page where it was full of Robert Greene fanboys. Guys would flex post themselves working out with a sweaty-ass towel, draped picturesque against a copy of one of Greene's books. Then some stupid mean post about grind set, mindset, or something or another. But I noticed a trend after a year or two. The guys posting their Greene would every so often post something along the lines of, quote, "Hey, I was just called into HR and they fired me." And then they'd launch into some failed plot hatched from a passage seemingly right out of Greene's books. I hate saying this in the video because I didn't screenshot any of this from back then. And, it's really shitty of me to accuse Greene of making, some assertions without evidence, which that's exactly what I'm doing. So I want to call out my own hypocrisy here. But in Thoughts from the Labyrinth, it's just my general experience that I'm talking about. This would have been back in 2013 or 14, but I just want to get that out up front. And if you do go and you happen to troll Reddit, you're going to find some old posts on there that contain more than a few similar stories like this. Stories of people getting really, really heavy into Robert Greene. They attempt to outmaneuver their quote-unquote opponents only to get called into HR or demoted, or just really, really bad things kind of happen to him. And it seems like his strategies would just kind of backfire on a lot of people. And this car wreck of just absolute shit can take the form of termination from a job, civil suits, loss of friendships, loss of career opportunities, and a kind of tendency, and this is probably the most disturbing, but there's this general tendency of these people to dehumanize their coworkers, families, and friends. It kind of goes back to the original quote by Greene himself. If you use his rules, then you are an ugly person. So maybe they're just ugly people who are posting these stories. But even if the avid followers and implementers of Greene strategies avoid these pitfalls, then there's something else. You can't escape the mental weight of trying to become a so-called strategist. In Greene's terminology, who was always 10 steps ahead of his opponents and coworkers. It's like they have the weight of LARPing an Emperor Palpatine, trying to build up an empire beginning with their small office cube or plumber's work truck. And this is the real poison of Greene's books. And I know I've said that before. This is real. This is what's behind it. But like an onion that's just kind of stinking and rotting, you just kind of peel back layer and layer. His books are attractive to young men who have a halfway developed view of reality. It's like you're trying to color in the lines of your epistemology with the bullshit tidbit wisdom of a guy who should be sitting at a bar talking about Ovid, not unleashing upon the world his own half-baked ideas of human nature and history. And really, I'm not even sure if these are Robert Greene's ideas of what human nature is. I know that Ryan Holiday is buddies with Robert Greene, and so I can't imagine someone like Ryan Holiday hanging out with someone who would just intentionally release a bunch of bullshit. But anyway, that aside, the result is that untold legions of guys have met with failure trying to implement his books by either overestimating their own abilities, getting fired, getting sued, and really just losing out in a really bad and embarrassing way in the game that we call life. It's almost like if R.R. Martin took Game of Thrones and tried to implement a real-world strategy for running a business based on the realities, ontology, and structure of his fantasy novels. It wouldn't work, people, because humans don't behave like characters in a book when it comes to real life. At the very end of it, there's no strategy that you can implement because people do unexpected fucking things. So, in closing, I'd like to say that if you do follow Greene's rules, expect nothing but hardship coming your way in the long term. It's not an imperfect guide to life, career, and personal success. It's a stairway leading straight down to your own personal purgatory of termination, loss of friendships, and possible legal action from a bunch of fucking asshats. His strategies simply don't map onto the real world outside the pages of his books. My general critique is that his stuff is simply vague, general, fanciful, and it's going to lead to failure. Take it from me, I've been in the real world now for decades, and from what I've found, you need a real nuts and bolts guide. If you are looking for a how-to book, positively book, or whatever you want to call it, as a general rule, the more vague they are, the more, amorphous their message is, the more they're going to be full of bullshit. And I'm not saying this necessarily about Robert Greene. I mean, it's definitely a higher quality than that. But always remember, folks, that life is messy. Life can get very dark. Life is also sad. Life is unfair, but not in a moral kind of way. Morals seem to exist in our heads, not so much out there, if you get my meaning. No, life is supremely indifferent to us and our plans. It doesn't react to us in a way like the self-help gurus want us to think. As I've grown in my career and personal life, I've learned that simply being a decent human being, treating other people with kindness and forethought, beats any of Greene's book any day of the week, even though he would probably say that I'm following one of the rules of his books. In fact, I don't think Greene would say that. He seems like a decent person. I think he would agree with that. So you have my ramblings on Robert Greene. I don't advise anybody go out and buy his books, but if you do, just be warned, and then only certain circumstances and people should really be diving into this. Instead, if you are looking for great self-help books or references for either yourself or your loved ones, I'd recommend the authors that I'm going to list in my show notes. They're all tempered by the fires of life. Get the wisdom from someone who is actually returning from the trenches and has something to say about the position, strength, and capabilities of the enemy you will be facing. Anyway, I hope you've gotten something from this video. Let me know what you think in the comment section. If you are watching this on YouTube, and if you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please leave me a 5-star review. And if you are listening to this on Spotify, I invite you to scroll on up, hit the follow, and give me a 5-star rating. Thanks, and have a good one. I look forward to hearing from you all.